transmitting from the heart of Times Square on 99.5 FM, WBAI New York, Pacifica Radio for the tri-state area. This is TrumpWatch, a weekly series investigating the actions of and reactions to President Donald J. Trump and his administration. I'm your host, Jesse Lent.
Conrad, Tokyo, Sparrow, Pistachio, just done national, dog is off sabbatical, rather watch an exigent.
Mr. President, thank you. Throughout this process, I've witnessed firsthand your appreciation for the vital role of the American judiciary. No president has ever consulted more widely or talked with more people from more backgrounds to seek input about a Supreme Court nomination. Mr. President, I am grateful to you, and I'm humbled by your confidence in me. Thank you. My judicial philosophy is straightforward. A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law. A judge must interpret statutes as written, and a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent. For the past 11 years, I've taught hundreds of students, primarily at Harvard Law School. I teach that the Constitution's separation of powers protects individual liberty. And I remain grateful to the dean who hired me, Justice Elena Kagan.
That was President Trump's nominee for Supreme Court Justice, Brett Kavanaugh, speaking on Monday at a press conference announcing his selection, edited for Time, footage courtesy the White House press office. Hello and welcome to TrumpWatch. Tonight, we'll take a deep dive on Judge Kavanaugh and what his confirmation would mean for the Supreme Court and for the country with Mark Walsh of the Peabody Award-winning website devoted to reporting on the Supreme Court, SCOTUSblog. He'll be joining us live in just a moment. Currently a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and a former staff secretary to President George W. Bush, Kavanaugh would replace the so-called swing justice on the court, Anthony Kennedy, nominated by Ronald Reagan back in 1987. From gay marriage to his ruling in the 1992 Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey decision, which upheld Roe v. Wade, the landmark 1973 Supreme Court ruling that overturned laws criminalizing or restricting a woman's access to an abortion, Kennedy was a decisive vote on the court for 3 decades. And although he is known to be politically conservative, his record on bucking partisan loyalties in the name of defending personal liberty has made him a beloved, if somewhat beleaguered, ally of the left. When Kennedy announced his retirement on June 27th, it prompted an outpouring of fear and frustration among progressive activists around the country that President Trump's Supreme Court pick would, quote, radically reverse the course of American justice and democracy, as House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi tweeted on Tuesday. But in light of the Republican-controlled Senate eliminating the filibuster for Supreme Court picks last year, the Senate now only needs 50 votes, counting Vice President Mike Pence's vote in the event of a tie, to confirm Kavanaugh. Yet with the Republicans controlling the Senate by the narrowest of margins, 51-49, with Republican Senator John McCain on leave while battling brain cancer, will Kavanaugh be the continuation of Justice Kennedy, who he once clerked for, who was confirmed with unanimous support in the Senate, or will his nomination be reminiscent of President Reagan's other 1987 Supreme Court Justice nomination, Robert Bork, blocked from confirmation for his conservative views? Here to help answer that question is Mark Walsh, a reporter for the Peabody Award-winning SCOTUSblog, a website devoted to reporting on the Supreme Court. He was in attendance when President Trump announced Brett Kavanaugh as his pick for the Supreme Court, which he wrote about in a unique first-person format for his July 10th article, A View from the East Room, The Brett Kavanaugh Story. Hello, Mark. Welcome to Trump Watch. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hello, Jesse. Happy to be here.
Before we get to Brett Kavanaugh, I was hoping you could give our listeners a bit of context regarding Judge Anthony Kennedy's legacy on the Supreme Court. I alluded to this in the intro, but what are some of the more substantial ways that Kennedy affected the Supreme Court?
Well, it just can't be overstated how Justice Kennedy, particularly in the last 12 years since Justice Sandra Day O'Connor left the court, Justice Kennedy's been at the center. He was really part of the center with Justice O'Connor for many years before that. And Justice Kennedy is really quite conservative on many issues and was crucial to the 5-4 vote in Bush-Gore to deliver the presidency to George W. Bush, has been, pretty pro-government and in many areas, criminal prosecutions, the death penalty. But he's certainly will be remembered and is known for his landmark decisions on gay rights, for being one of the crucial votes to uphold the fundamental right to abortion, even though Justice Kennedy has upheld various restrictions on abortion, and more recently, voting to uphold an affirmative action plan, a race-conscious college admissions plan at the University of Texas at Austin, after he'd been generally skeptical of such plans for most of his career. And that's an example of the way he's been referred to as the swing justice, not a moniker he liked. He likes to say that the cases swing, I don't.
Right.
But he's done swinging, or will be as of July 31st, and with the court's term substantially done, he's now soon to be a former justice.
How much do you buy that the cases swing, he doesn't? Do you believe that Justice Kennedy's personal judicial philosophy has developed over the more than 30 years he was on the court, or was he mostly consistent in his way of ruling on cases?
Well, many people, since he stepped down from the court, have written about how it's been hard to identify what his political philosophy and judicial philosophy actually was, what amounted to. I mean, I think it's true to the extent that he just had these iconoclastic views and was just going to vote a certain way in some cases and vote the other way in other kinds of cases. And so, he just was, it was very hard to predict in many areas of the law. And so that's why lawyers arguing before the court were often aiming their arguments directly at him and needed his vote.
Right. I've often heard that, and maybe you could expand on that a little bit. What are some of the ways that if you were a lawyer crafting your argument for Kennedy, for Justice Kennedy, what are some of the things that argument would need to include because of that?
Well, you want, as the lawyer, you want to be sophisticated about this to the extent you can. You're seasoned on any position he may have taken on a given topic, such as in the example I cited before, affirmative action. I mean, it was not guaranteed that he was going to vote to uphold the University of Texas admission system just a couple of years ago, but by seizing on just language that he'd used to suggest that, diversity is an important interest of American education system, that, that's something you would emphasize. And it wasn't just the lawyers who would do that, it was the other justices. During arguments, they would often parrot what Justice Kennedy said, and they're often speaking to each other in oral argument anyway through their questions, and they might say, as Justice Kennedy was just asking, let me go back to that, because they were trying to win his vote as well.
So, from what you've seen in your reporting so far, what are some of the major ways that Judge Brett Kavanaugh is different from Justice Kennedy?
Well, that's an interesting question because and I don't know all of his opinions up and down yet. He's, has some 300 opinions on the bench in the Federal Appellate Court in Washington. He has a significant career before that, and he is just, thought to be generally conservative. I think, the conclusion that many people are drawing is he's not the most conservative from President Trump's short list, even of finalists, so-called finalists. That choice would have been Judge Amy Coney Barrett, and there are some conservatives. I go to liberal events here in Washington and conservative events, and was at a event at the Heritage Foundation yesterday, which is one of the groups that supplied names to the president's list, including particularly Brett Kavanaugh's, and not just Heritage people, but other conservatives from other groups. Some of them seemed disappointed that the choice was not Barrett. But in some ways, I don't think Judge Kavanaugh will be that much different from Justice Kennedy, but I think in general his track record is a little more solidly conservative. When Vice President Mike Pence, when he just tweeted something to congratulate Kennedy the day he retired, he said, "Congratulations to Justice Kennedy. We're going to be aiming to fill his seat with someone like Antonin Scalia, not Anthony Kennedy." That's what many, in the administration are hoping for.
Right. Speaking of the Heritage Foundation, you report in your July 10th article that the president, in introducing Kavanaugh on Monday as a Supreme Court pick, said, quote, "In keeping with President Reagan's legacy, I do not ask about a nominee's personal opinions. What matters is not a judge's political views, but whether they can set aside those views to do what the law and the Constitution require." Do you believe the president is being truthful here? Brett Kavanaugh, as you mentioned, was included in a list of 25 possible Supreme Court picks that Trump released on the campaign trail, which had been furnished by the Heritage Foundation and others. It seems like the president had a pretty good sense of Kavanaugh's personal opinions.
Yeah, the emphasis, the president there, I think, was I do not ask. And that's the area that seems to be verboten. You don't ask how they might rule on particular cases, and I don't think any potential nominee would even answer such a question. But the point of that whole vetting process is to make that, completely unnecessary, because you check the nominees and potential nominees' record as closely as you can, and provide your best advice on how he or she would likely vote on some of these particularly hot issues. And it's not completely clear how Judge Kavanaugh might address things like abortion. Most people expect him to be likely to maybe uphold some of the kind of abortion restrictions, and you could debate for hours on whether that requires overruling Roe versus Wade or Planned Parenthood versus Casey. There are plenty of people who say they don't need to do that to uphold some of the restrictions that states are trying to pass, and certainly others would disagree about that.
Is the idea of a swing justice on the Supreme Court outdated? Could this actually happen again, or are our politics too bitterly divided for a president to select a Supreme Court nominee whose beliefs allow for the same kind of nuance that Kennedy seemed to have?
Yeah, so a couple things there. That no one is expecting that Judge Kavanaugh is going to be moving into that center slot. There are political scientists who come up with these scales, and they evaluate cases and pigeonhole them, and Judge Kavanaugh, if he becomes Justice Kavanaugh, would I think fall, and I don't have those charts in front of me, but would fall somewhere between the more conservative members of the court, but not on the far end, and that's Justice Sam Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Neil Gorsuch. Chief Justice John Roberts is now going to be the person in the middle, but he's not expected to swing the way Anthony Kennedy did on some of these big issues. And it's been a long time since the Chief Justice was at the median point on the ideological spectrum, and the Chief Justice has certain institutional interests at heart for the court, and so we're just going to have to see how that shakes out for John Roberts.
Do you know how common it's been in the history of the Supreme Court for there to be a swing justice like Kennedy?
Well, I don't know about over the whole history, and certainly, the justices like to point out, we're in, unanimous 60% of the time. Well, that figure fell to 39% this past term, and does more often average, in the 40 to 50% range. Then it's often the more contentious issues that are 5-4 or otherwise closely divided. But certainly for the recent history, there has been a swing justice on some of these key issues. And it was Lewis Powell before he retired in 1987, and then Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy stepped into that spot and kind of shared it. And then when, as I said before, when Justice O'Connor retired, it was really Justice Kennedy.
I'm speaking with Mark Walsh, a reporter for SCOTUSblog. You're listening to TrumpWatch on WBAI New York. My name is Jesse Lent. Mark Walsh, a central theme of your July 10th article, A View from the East Room, the Brett Kavanaugh story, is the sort of throwback, the traces of 1987, the year of two different Supreme Court nominees, an era oddly brought into sharp focus for you by the filmmakers of the upcoming Wonder Woman 1984 film who were shooting in D.C. as you made your way to the announcement ceremony. Can you describe this bizarre scene a little bit, but also more broadly, where you see the parallels to the 1980s in President Trump's nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court?
Sure, and to very briefly go over what I had written, that I'm in an Uber on my way to the White House for this ceremony, which is at 9 o'clock. We were supposed to be there by 7:30 or 8, and I attended the one for Judge Gorsuch and other similar events, and otherwise I'm not normally a White House reporter. I'm usually at the Supreme Court, and I live in Washington, so was taking my Uber, in fact, being a backseat driver, and said, why don't you just go down Pennsylvania Avenue? And then we run into this big film set as the sun was getting ready to go down, not for another hour or so, where they were setting up for this Wonder Woman sequel, which is Wonder Woman 1984, and it's set in Ronald Reagan's America. And then, just struck me later during the ceremony, there were so many references to Ronald Reagan, who's, of course, still revered by many Republicans and many on the right, and any parallels they can draw. So what's ultimately kind of interesting about, this choice of Brett Kavanaugh is that this would be almost as if Ronald Reagan had chosen Anthony Kennedy for the vacancy created by Lewis Powell when it first came open. But, of course, that's not what President Reagan did. He chose kind of a poke in the eye to Democrats and liberals by choosing Robert Bork. That did not turn out well. And his second choice, you may remember, was a federal appeals court judge in Washington named Douglas Ginsburg. That nomination had to be withdrawn when there was news about Ginsburg smoking marijuana. Students at Harvard, with even as relatively recently, and attitudes sort of changed quickly after that. But that was seen as too damaging. And Anthony Kennedy, whom Reagan knew from Sacramento, was the number 3, and eventually joined the court midterm in early 1988.
Do you think that's significant, the fact that he was the third nominee? Do you think that Reagan, clearly his first pick was not someone in the center. Do you think that, say today, if Kavanaugh is not able to get through, do you think there is some hope for progressives that you could at least get closer to an Anthony Kennedy if, as we've already established, getting another swing justice is pretty much something no one's expecting?
Well, I'm not sure how much hope progressives should take. Certainly if they were able to somehow contribute to the defeat of Brett Kavanaugh, that would change political calculus, and the president would have to come up with someone, presumably because the votes were not there, that had some better guarantee of not overturning certain precedents. But still, that doesn't mean he's going to go and nominate Merrick Garland, who was President Obama's choice, the one who never got a vote. He would go back to his list, and there are not a lot of liberals or progressives on that list. In fact, there are none. There are just some that would maybe turn out to be a little more like Justice Kennedy than like Justice Scalia. My take is, I think progressives have an uphill battle in this, but there's a lot that can be, surprising in these nomination fights. Things can come out, some surprises and what have you, but we'll see what happens as we're already into this process.
The scene you describe in your article of Monday's announcement ceremony at the White House, with a room so conservative that you report that a couple audience members even audibly gasped when Kavanaugh thanked Justice Elena Kagan, an Obama-era nominee, now Supreme Court Justice, for hiring him as a professor when she was a dean at Harvard Law School. With not a Democrat in sight and overflowing with Trump cabinet members, it sounded surreal in its made-for-TV quality. How different is this from Supreme Court nominee announcements you've covered in the past, and how so?
Well, the one thing about President Trump is that he's done it pretty much the same way for both Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. It's gone pretty well. There's a lot that has not gone well in the Trump administration. I'm sure your listeners would agree. But this thing they sort of have down, and that's why he pretty much repeated and even kept it more under wraps, the actual name than, but we're talking by degrees here, by mere minutes, as far as the name not really getting leaked out much beforehand. There have been all kinds of different ways that nominees have been announced. Again, usually not in prime time, although someone was reminding me that John Roberts did have an event that was in the evening. Clarence Thomas was announced pretty quickly after the retirement of Thurgood Marshall back in 1991, and from President George H.W. Bush's summer compound in Kennebunkport. I noticed, and after sort of looking up, that when it did come around to Judge Kennedy, and Anthony Kennedy being the third person, it was Ronald Reagan just trotted out to the White House briefing room, which is pretty small, and just like an everyday press conference, and that would not happen today. I mean, there's just too much stagecraft and showmanship that the White House wants to put into this, and it's if nothing else, it's worked well for President Trump.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jesse. It's always fun to talk about the Supreme Court, and especially when at this stage where the White House is involved and Congress. Senate will soon be involved, and we'll see what happens.
Indeed we will. I've been speaking with Mark Walsh, a reporter for SCOTUSblog, a website devoted to reporting on the Supreme Court. He was in attendance when President Trump announced Brett Kavanaugh as his pick for the Supreme Court, which he wrote about in a unique first-person format in his July 10th article, A View from the East Room, The Brett Kavanaugh Story. You're listening to Trump Watch with Jesse Lent on WBAI New York. And going out with a little music from 1987 from Prince's landmark album Sign of the Times tonight. That's going to do it for this week's show. You can hear all 77 episodes of Trump Watch with Jesse Lent at soundcloud.com/TrumpWatchWBAI or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter, where our handle is TrumpWatchWBAI, and I'll be back next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. when we'll break down another aspect of the Donald Trump administration. Until then, I'm your host, Jesse Lent. Talk to you next time.
Machine gun.